What's happening, everybody? On today's show, we're going to talk all things Ole Miss ahead of the Grove Bowl spring game coming up this weekend. What will decide this quarterback battle? Who are some names to keep an eye on for the Rebels? How much of a difference will Pete Golding have in year one in Oxford? We're going to talk all about it with Stephen Willis, host of Locked On Ole Miss. Locked On SEC starts right now.
Are Locked On SEC, your daily podcast on the Southeastern Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And what is happening, everybody? Welcome into Locked On SEC. It's great to have you guys along. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. I'm Chris Gordy. Thanks for making Locked On SEC your first listen every day. And remember, you can check us out on all platforms, wherever you find your podcasts, including YouTube and at LockedOnSEC.com. Let's jump into it. Let's welcome our buddy Stephen Willis, host of Locked On Ole Miss, as we get into it. Tons of SEC teams playing their spring games this weekend. And so today we stop off in Oxford and talk all things Ole Miss with Stephen Willis. Stephen, how's your offseason been? I know it's flew by for me.
Well, it was kind of dead, and then they hired Chris Beard, and then spring happened and it started picking up pretty well. So I think the fan base is pretty fired up. Doing a little experiment today about a basketball cover in the middle of spring practice. We'll see how that video does.
Well, let's jump into it. It's funny, as I went around each SEC team, Stephen, I started with, what's the burning question? What's the big question with each team? And man, even though we have so many returning starting quarterbacks from a year ago in the SEC, it still feels like so many schools, the burning question is who's going to be the starting quarterback. And obviously Alabama and Georgia, they're at the pinnacle. They got to figure out who to replace Stetson Bennett and Bryce Young. With Ole Miss, they're the rare case. They bring back Jaxson Dart, who was so productive a year ago, but Lane Kiffin not resting on his laurels. He goes and gets Walker Howard, the 5-star transfer from LSU, and he adds Spencer Sanders, the all Big 12 accomplished quarterback in all his years there at Oklahoma State. But where are we with the quarterback battle from what you're hearing, what you've seen, everything heading into the spring game, the Grove Bowl this weekend? Where are we with the quarterbacks?
Well, when the quarterback competition was announced and these quarterbacks were signed, ESPN and all the national flyover media was all like, hey, this quarterback competition, even some is talking about Spencer Sanders leading the team, but this quarterback competition hasn't really materialized. And that isn't anything against Spencer Sanders or Walker Howard. It's just how good Jaxson Dart apparently has been this spring. Lane Kiffin in Tuesday's press conference said that Jaxson Dart has thrown one interception this spring. And if he could cut down his interception, that's what we said last year. He has all the tools. I call him a 5-tool quarterback. He can do a little bit of everything. And now it looks like it's starting to materialize. Like I said, this isn't a slight against Spencer. This isn't a slight against Walker Howard. I think it's just a testament of how well Jaxson Dart is playing right now.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look back at the year he had, obviously just shy of 3,000 passing yards, but 20 touchdowns with the 11 interceptions. It feels like so many of those picks came on the backstretch of the season where the losses started to come and they had all those wins at the start of the year. But it makes me think back to last year's spring game, Stephen, when Jackson was kind of thrown into the fire. You had Luke Altmaier and other guys, but it felt like Jackson was trying to do too much in that spring game. Remember, the weather wasn't all that great, but the wind was blowing, but man, he was just off target on so many throws, and it felt like he was forcing the issue. This might be a different Jaxson Dart who maybe feels a little bit more relaxed having been in the system for a year.
You're exactly right. Last year, it felt like during the spring game that Jaxson Dart was trying to win the quarterback battle on every throw. And he had been in Oxford for 4 weeks at that point, and his whole world was just like a chaotic thing. But now he's settled in, he's comfortable. He's gone into press conferences where he said, hey, I view myself as the starter. I mean, I hear about quarterback competition. I understand you need quarterbacks in the room. You need that kind of depth, but I think I am the starter, and he's performing like that. And honestly, the team and the fan base is starting to follow him that way. Like I said, this isn't a slight on Spencer Sanders or Walker Howard. I think this is just a testament of how well Jaxson Dart is handling this, because everything I've heard in spring is people just whispering with Walker Howard is like, hey, this looks like when Eli was a redshirt freshman. And stuff like that gets me really excited about the future. But I think that even pushes Jaxson Dart a little bit. Even the threat of Spencer, which we thought everything was going to push him, I think the young butt, Walker Howard, really coming there and showing out is pushing him a little bit as well. And Jaxson is really rising to the occasion.
Yeah, I was talking about this with you before we started the show, but it does feel like when we look at what other teams have done, I think of LSU a year ago, they had Miles Brennan, who everybody was expecting was going to be the fifth-year senior starter. They had some young quarterbacks like Garrett Nussmeier, yet they still went into the portal and got Jaden Daniels from Arizona State. And I think a lot of us were kind of shocked when they announced Jaden Daniels was the starter. Contrast that to Auburn, where this offseason they didn't add anybody through the portal. They still have TJ Finley, Holden Garner, and Robbie Ashford, but they've had nobody to push Robbie Ashford. And so, not shocked when you hear Robbie Ashford he looks okay, but doesn't look like the stud guy that maybe he could be. It's interesting. You talk about you bring in a guy like Spencer Sanders. Everybody just assumes he's going to be the guy. But again, Lane Kiffin, the mad scientist, may be thinking this is just what Jaxson Dart needed. Somebody really good to come in and have a legitimate shot of winning the job to push him to be the best.
Yeah, if you want to look at Lane Kiffin as this was intentionally done, this wasn't a situation where Spencer Sanders was being brought in to start. It was at least brought in to where everybody involved, their ears are going to perk up. And you have their attention at that point because everybody's like, well, he wouldn't do this if he would. Let's see, I've heard 13 or 14 times this spring, they wouldn't have signed him if he wasn't going to play him. And
right.
That you hear that over and over again. I was like, no, that's not how this works. The number one tenet of this program is all from the Pete Carroll school. Ed Orgeron did the same thing when he was at Ole Miss, is competition, competing. And if that room doesn't look like it's supposed to look, he is going to rectify that to the utmost extreme. And it's just the way he is built, the way he is wired. And the players take on the personality of the coach and they thrive on it.
Well, let's closing out this thought. Is there anything Spencer Sanders can do to elevate himself in this race? I mean, let's say the Grove Bowl this weekend, he goes out and throws for multiple touchdowns and looks great. I mean, is there anything he can do at this point? Again, we're only in April. A lot can change before we get into September, but is there anything Spencer Sanders can do to elevate himself back into that QB1 spot?
I think get healthy is the main thing for him. They've had him kind of on a pitch count this spring, and that has hurt him trying to compete for the starting job. At the spring game, I don't think it's going to matter that much for him. Heck, there's 3 practices for Ole Miss after the spring game. It's the weirdest thing in the world. But in the fall, he'll have a chance because he's seen all these coverages. There's nothing that's going to surprise him. He's seen it all in the field. So we'll see what he can do in the fall if this can ramp up. The question just becomes, is the gap too much for Spencer Sanders to actually overcome and catch Jaxson, or can that experience and everything play through in the fall? We'll see, because I do not expect Lane Kiffin to name a starting quarterback after spring, and nor should he with the transfer portal, honestly. But we'll see exactly what happens. Oh, before we get off the quarterbacks, this is how I expect it to go, by the way. I think the starting quarterback is either going to be Jaxson Dart or Spencer Sanders. I think whoever loses that job will be the third string quarterback, and the backup quarterback is just guaranteed to be Walker Howard at this point.
And in that scenario, I mean, Dart or Sanders wouldn't sit at 3, right? They'd probably hit the transfer portal again.
Yeah, I would think so. I think they would. Whoever lost that job, there would be somewhere else, because heck, if you look at Spencer Sanders, this is it. This is his last bullet in the gun. And I'm sure he is not going to go through all of these football practices to sit on the bench. And if he looks like he's going to do that, something would happen. Like I said, Jackson's kind of the same way. But like I said, Jaxson right now is playing so well. I don't expect him to go anywhere except the starting quarterback for the Mercer game, to be honest.
There you go. Mark the tape here. Mid-April, Stephen Willis says Jaxson Dart will be the starter. Again, a lot can change between now and September, so we'll see. More with Stephen Willis here in just a second as we continue to preview the Grove Bowl with him. But first, this episode is presented to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Look, grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back, and there's no better place to get in on all the MLB action than FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn to sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you don't win. Again, go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Don't miss your chance at your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Again, FanDuel, they are the official partner of Major League Baseball. FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. And continue our conversation with Stephen Willis, host of Locked On Ole Miss. And Stephen, we spent the first segment talking all about the quarterbacks. I figured here we talk about all the rest. Let's go to the running back spot. Obviously, a lot of hype and fanfare with Quinshon Judkins coming off of the fantastic freshman season he had. It was amazing when I was going back to the numbers, Stephen. I mean, he was even better than I remembered in looking back at some of the games. But over 1,500 rushing yards and 16 rushing touchdowns. It doesn't get any better than that. Zach Evans is on his way out, but is there another name to maybe keep an eye on in the backfield? Because we know the system that Lane Kiffin has had these last couple of years, as good as Judkins has been, man, they like to use multiple running backs.
Two backs in the backfield. Ulysses Bentley IV was hurt last year. He's a former all-conference AAC guy at SMU at his time there. He's had a really productive spring because, as you can imagine, Quinshon has definitely been on a pitch count this summer. They're not going to risk that contact. And then also in the fall, Kedrick Ruscano, there's a type that Ole Miss recruits in running backs, the extreme lateral movement, a lot of the same stuff that Quinshon can do, maybe not the height, but pay attention to him. Even Henry Parrish could do it to a little bit, but Kedrick Ruscano, over 100 yards in the Polynesian Bowl. I think he is a guy that could really be a pick to click in the future.
What about wide receivers? I know Dayton Wade is a guy who's been talked about, Jordan Watkins, J.J. Henry, but they went into the transfer portal and they added a couple of pieces. And one of them, you can't deny that, when you talk about A&M and Chris Marshall, the 5-star prospect he was. Trey Harris, I know, has been banged out coming in from Louisiana Tech, but what should we expect from the wide receivers here at Ole Miss?
I think it has a chance to be fairly explosive, and that's mainly because of the tight end room as well. I'll talk about that in just a second, but Chris Harris has had a wonderful spring. I mean, they're putting videos up on the social account. They're promoting him. He's making great catches and plays, and if he's doing that, it's because that somebody is pointed to, hey, we need to get this done. Trey Harris has been injured through part of the spring, but he's an all-conference USA guy who transferred in from Louisiana Tech. And then you have the guys like Brandon Buckhalter, who has declared that has a relationship built with Walker Howard running that. He's somebody that has a chance to break out. Braylon Brown was a 4-star out of high school, has a chance to break out. And that includes that's even before J.J. Henry and Jordan Watkins and Dayton Wade and those guys. That wide receiver room has a chance to be really deep. Now, I think Ole Miss this year is going to look like they always have, but there's going to be a lot of 12 personnel a la Georgia on the field this year. They're going to take the stuff that Georgia does with Brock Bowers and insert Michael Trigg into that position, with Caden Prescorn being the traditional hand in the dirt tight end. Prescorn was rated the number 7 tight end coming out this year by Pro Football Focus. So he's a really good player, and Trigg, of course, is a super athlete. There's probably only 2 or 3 teams in the country that has a tight end that's that athletic. So you mix that with the wide receivers, I think some weapons could be in play that we're not used to. And also it's going to help Quinshon, Ulysses, Kedrick Ruscano, because you're going to have an extra 250-pound guy in the slot blocking. And I think this offense is going to look closer to what it did in 2020, but it might be more effective on the ground because of what Quinshon and those guys bring.
Yeah, and Prescorn, by the way, 6'5", 255 coming over from Memphis. He's even bigger than Michael Trigg, and I thought Trigg was a pretty big body guy. So it'll be interesting to see those tight ends at work. Any difference in the offense? We know Lane kind of took a little bit of a step back last year and deferring a little bit more when it comes to play calling, and he's still very involved in the game plan and all that. But anything different you think we'll see in the offense this year?
I think it's going to look closer to what it did in 2020 and 2021. Last year, Jaxson Dart had a little bit of trouble over the middle of the field with the linebackers from time to time. There was not a trust level that coaches need to be with the quarterbacks. And because of that, there was a lot of passes thrown outside the number, a lot of passes thrown well down the hill, downfield, and that led to a donut-sized hole. And this offense, when it really clicks, it truly affects linebackers through the jet sweeps, forcing false steps laterally, receivers in the slot and the tight end behind the linebackers. You don't really know what you do, and that causes the hole to get even a little bit bigger. Some of the success that Ole Miss lost at the end of the season was because the other teams realized they didn't have to worry about that. They could just completely key on Quinshawn or Zach Evans, and those linebackers really had. Like Mississippi State had 14 or 15 tackles for loss, and we all remember what Texas Tech did, and that was because the offense had essentially pigeonholed itself. So I think they're going to get back to what they were doing. They were going to expand it. And because of that, you're going to see this offense be even a little bit more dynamic than anybody's expecting, because there's weapons all over the field on that offense. I mean, Quinshon Judkins is the first team preseason Walter Camp All-American, and that's rare for Ole Miss. And then you have Chris Marshall and those guys on the outside and those tight ends. There's a chance they'll be really, really explosive.
Charlie Weiss Jr., John David Baker, Lane Kiffin. Who's calling plays on Saturday on the side, or either on the sideline or from the booth?
Lane Kiffin, the offensive coordinator within the fan base. If you wonder, there might be some semantics, and there might be like a play sheet, like 1st and 10 to 15. We're calling these, the same stuff that's off of a play sheet that all three of them put together. But the final say is going to go to Lane Kiffin, and I think he's going to take it over a little bit.
Let's switch to the other side of the ball. Obviously, a lot of hype and excitement for Pete Golding and taking over that defense. Look, one man's trash is another man's treasure, and I say that with no disrespect, but Alabama fans were yelling and angry at Pete Golding. They wanted excellence. They wanted top 5 defenses, and Pete Golding gave them top 10, top 20 defenses, but it wasn't the cream of the crop that they wanted. But for Ole Miss, look, we'll take a top 20 defense. I think that's what they're saying. So Pete Golding, a lot of people excited. We've already seen the repercussions of him, Ole Miss winning a lot of transfers and recruits on the defensive side of the ball as soon as Pete Golding stepped foot over in Oxford. So what do you make of the transition and the change in the defensive scheme with Pete Golding coming over?
Honestly, I think Alabama fans are a little bit spoiled. Because if you look at that also coincided with some of the most explosive offenses in the history of college football. And to think that is not going to affect the defense, just look at what Georgia does. Georgia runs the same. They look like 2011 Alabama over there. They protect that defense. And because of that defense is dominant. And I think the fact that Georgia and Kirby has that dominant defense, that kind of tweaks Alabama fans, because they're used to being 1st or 2nd in the country. So when they see a 15, that's a problem. But that's not an indictment, in my opinion, at all on Pete Golding. From what I've seen, Pete Golding's a very hands-on coach. The players really seem to like him. We have a couple of players that are kind of friends of the podcast that have interacted with people that have come on there, and they just really love the guy. And that being said, I do think this year it could be a little bit clunky, because for 2 years, Ole Miss has recruited to this 3-2-6, to where you essentially have certain player profiles at the point. But the point of that is there's not many front 7 players, or in that case, a front 5 player, and a ton of defensive backs. So whenever you're trying to find a specialty player like a jack position player, somebody that at Alabama was the Will Anderson role, that player doesn't exist yet on Ole Miss's roster. Suntarian Perkins, where are you going to play him? We'll find that out in the fall as well. So we'll see what this defense looks like. I don't anticipate this first defense being anywhere higher than 60th nationally, but I do expect this defense to turn the other team over, to be really good in the red zone and do stuff like that and flash at certain points. So it'll be really interesting to see. I'm a huge Pete Golding guy. I'm looking forward to what he can do. I mean, Ole Miss is over the moon at the fact that he's having, and for no other reason than his recruiting ability. He's doing a fantastic job in the state of Mississippi.
Yeah, I was going to say that, we became accustomed to that 3-2-6, but it feels like he's, his systems at Alabama were all 3-4, and maybe they were more accustomed to running that. But if you don't have the dogs to do that just yet, maybe you can't. But Tavius Robinson is gone. He's a guy we're actually going to have on the show next week to talk about preparing for the draft. But big JJ Pegues is back. I know he's excited about maybe, an expanded role this year. Cedric Johnson, Jared Ivey. Who are some guys in your mind to keep an eye on that projected starters right now on the defense?
That defensive line, when you look at it, was potentially Cedric Johnson, Jared Ivey, JJ Pegues, but either Josh Harris or Xavion Harris, both of which are just absolutely mountains of men. They're just like Xavion Harris is like 6'7", 360. I mean, he's massive. Those guys will be the leaders of that defense. So running the ball in Ole Miss probably is not going to be something they should do. And you think that would be counterproductive with them recruiting so many defensive backs. But the defensive backs they recruited were first for specific things, like Ladarius Tennyson. He was essentially a box safety, as I call it, which is essentially just an undersized outside linebacker. But in this defense, he's either going to play that hybrid role of linebacker safety that might be Suntarian Perkins playing over there. That's kind of where we're earmarking in the fan base where he could be. Or we're going to find out if he can play safety, and he's going to be like a straight strong safety or free safety. Can he do that? I mean, there's players over there that do have the ball skills and the skills to do that, but these box safety types, they're kind of tweeners for a reason. And we'll see if they'll be able to convert system to system.
Yeah, it's funny. I was looking through that secondary, and obviously it was some new faces there. Tennyson is back, but you lose AJ Finley, you lose Otis Reese, and you lose some familiar players back there. Is anybody that they brought in through the portal? You think you mentioned Josh Harris on the D line, but I remember the Louisville linebacker they brought in Monty Montgomery, and then maybe Deshaun Gaddy, the DB, or any of those guys you think going to play a big role right off the bat?
We'll have to wait and see into the fall. I think the most watched position battle for the Grow Bowl, if anybody wants to watch the Grow Bowl, check out the linebackers, because you have Ashanti Seastrunk, who's a returner, and you have Kari Coleman, who's a returner, who right now is penciled in as the starter, but right behind them is Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste from UCF and Monty Montgomery from Louisville. And both of those guys were brought in to play. So it has a situation that where as experience gets gathered, when Ole Miss played Louisville 2 years ago, Monty Montgomery was a problem for Louisville until he went out with a targeting penalty. So, I mean, he's a really good player. If he's a little bit, I think he might be a little bit shorter than people think of, kind of sawed off, but a really good player. If you're old enough like me, you remember Sam Mills. Height doesn't necessarily bother me. But in the defensive backfield, John Saunders from Miami, Ohio, that they brought in, he's a 6'4" corner. He kind of made his bones last year in a game versus Kentucky. And that just feels weird to say, but it's actually true. But he shut down that wide receiving group that was pretty good last year. And he's a 6'4" corner, kind of a Miles Battle clone. He can play corner, but they've moved him to safety. So he might be somebody you can pay attention and watch too, that might be taking over for AJ Finley.
Continue our conversation with Stephen Willis, host of Locked On Ole Miss. And Stephen, we're getting ready for the Grove Bowl this weekend. We talked about some guys to keep an eye on and look at, but I wanted to spend the last few minutes of the show just kind of looking at what are realistic expectations as we look ahead to the 2023 schedule for Ole Miss, and want to kind of run through it. And you tell me where you think we should be penciling in W's and where maybe a potential loss could come, and what a realistic expectation is for the season. So obviously you guys open things up with Mercer. We all expect that'll be the good tune-up game. No problems with them, and should get a win there. But week 2 is tricky. Week 2 at Tulane, probably a year or two ago, this didn't look like such a tough game, going to New Orleans and having to play down there at Ullman. But man, having to play the Tulane team that just beat USC and Caleb Williams in a bowl game, obviously they lose a lot, but Willie Fritz back there, this is going to be a tough test in week 2.
Yeah, Tulane's a good team. They're really well coached. Willie Fritz does a fantastic job. With Tyjae Spears being off of that team, this is going to be a different Tulane team, because Tyjae could be the first running back off the board in the NFL draft, and he ran for 200 yards against USC. He was a difference maker on that team. Now, they're still going to be good. I'm not expecting like it was when Tulane came to Oxford 2 years ago and it was like 63-20 or something like that. I'm not expecting that. But I wouldn't be surprised if the game was 35-27 or something like, in that realm. I think this is a game that I would say pencil in a W for Ole Miss. Don't write it in, but it's not really a toss-up either.
Yeah, Michael Pratt, by the way, back at quarterback for Tulane, threw for 3,000 yards, 27 touchdowns to just 5 interceptions last year. He almost looks like a Lane Kiffin type quarterback, and it will be interesting to see. Might be a shootout there in week 2 between Ole Miss and Tulane down in New Orleans. So let's say Ole Miss could survive that scare and they start 2-0. You get Georgia Tech in week 3, and again, this is a Georgia Tech team transitioning, new head coach, new regime, and all that. Should be a game that Ole Miss wins and wins handily.
Yeah, I think so as well. One little storyline for this game, Bobby Dodd and Georgia Tech, when they were in the SEC, absolutely refused to come to Oxford, Mississippi. So Georgia Tech would never come to Oxford, Mississippi. This will be the culmination of a fight that started in 1944 with Georgia Tech rolling into Vaught-Hemingway Stadium. But I do think Ole Miss should win that game. That's a game that I would lean more towards ink than Tulane.
So we start 3-0, and man, oh man, right out of the gates, SEC play, road trip to Tuscaloosa in Alabama. I would assume this is one you'd probably want later in the year rather than this early, but maybe it's good you get it out the way, and if it's a loss, and you move on. But last time Lane went there, man, all the hype, get your popcorn ready and all that, and all we saw was missed opportunities, going for all these 4th downs, not taking the field goals, not punting, and just mistake after mistake by Lane. I got a feeling maybe he's learned his mistake from 2 years ago.
Potentially, but the flip side of that is if you're going to get this Alabama team, they got talent just like they always do, but new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator, new quarterback. They lose Will Anderson. September would be the time to get them. I think, though, after that Texas game, they'll probably be clicking a little bit, but if you're going to get them and you're going to get Alabama, I will say this: Ole Miss has a better chance of getting Alabama than Georgia. But I would definitely pencil this as an L.
After that, you get home games against LSU and Arkansas, but 2 very scrappy teams who bring back their quarterbacks. Jaden Daniels and that offense run by Mike Denbrock back at LSU. And now we get to see a little bit of a different offense from Arkansas with Dan Enos running plays, but KJ Jefferson is back. So again, both home games in Oxford, but man, that almost feels like, if we're being optimistic, Steven, a 1-1 split. You maybe win one of those, lose the other one. Is that where you are?
You look at averages, that's probably how it's going to work out. But if you take those games as individual, I do think Ole Miss has the ability to beat LSU and Oxford. I think that's going to be a game. They're going to circle that because of what happened in Baton Rouge last year. And because of that, they'll be really up to play it. And Arkansas, the same thing. If what happened in Fayetteville had not have happened, I think this game would have a chance to be a better, closer game than it could have. But there's going to be some players that through LSU and Arkansas, they're going to want to take out some stuff. I think Ole Miss possibly could go 2-0 in there. I'll go 1-1, but I don't think 2-0 is outside the realm of possibility through those.
So we got Ole Miss at 4-2. I didn't hear you say Alabama was a win, so
no, it's an L. Yeah, I said it now.
We got them at 4-2 heading into the backstretch of the season, and we'll just kind of run through some of these. At Auburn, again, Hugh Freeze there, a little bit of a rivalry game. Maybe the Ole Miss faithful want this one a little bit more with Hugh back in the SEC, and a transition phase, right? He's settling in. It's year 1 of the rebuild there at Auburn, so we'll see. Maybe they're ripe for the pick-in. This is one that Ole Miss wins, just because they have more talent. Then you get Vanderbilt, which again is one you should win. I know Clark Lee's done a great job there. That team has improved, but I look at both of those as wins. What say you?
Auburn game, if that game is at nighttime, it's a completely different game if it's at 11 o'clock. And so that depends a lot of when it's going to be. I do think Ole Miss has a better team than Auburn this year. Vanderbilt, same type of situation. Clark Lee is doing a lot of good things. I enjoy watching Vanderbilt. The consensus, the people are saying Anthony Richardson, #1 pick. Well, he went up to Nashville and got beat last year. So, I mean, Vandy can beat some people. They were playing Tennessee with a chance to go to a bowl game. I expect Vandy to go to a bowl this year. And because of that, it'd be really interesting to see what they're building up there. But I do think that's 2 W's for Ole Miss.
After that, a home game against A&M. Man, that's a tough one. Connor Wegman, the Ole Miss game last year was where he kind of started to get his feet under him and looked the part. Ole Miss won that game, but A&M just they look like it all depends. Is Bobby Petrino improving that offense over Jimbo? That could be a really tough one.
That's also a game to where if this goes off the tracks, which it absolutely could go off the tracks, A&M's just kind of going through the motions at that point because Jimbo is going to be gone, Bobby Petrino is going to be gone, the whole thing. This has a chance to be a tire fire. It also has a chance to be a very if A&M is 8-2 or whatever, or 7-2 going into that ball game, that's a different atmosphere as well. But Jimbo has never defeated Lane Kiffin, and I honestly think that will continue, especially since they didn't change defensive coordinators and Ole Miss just ran up and down the field on that Aggies team. And that was with 5 stars absolutely everywhere. So we'll see what it does. I think Ole Miss is going to win that game in Vaught-Hemingway.
So we got Ole Miss at 7-2 right now. We're being optimistic here, and kind of taking it as they come. At Georgia, November 11th, we'll give them the L there. Again, new quarterback for Georgia, but it might be even more talented than Stetson Bennett. That's just going to be a tough one. So that puts us at 7-3. You get Louisiana Monroe, should win that one. And then the Egg Bowl to finish off the season. Mike Leach gone. What does Will Rogers look like without the Mike Leach scheme and system and playbook? We'll see. But I mean, that's 8-9 win season for Ole Miss, right?
No, the 4 for Ole Miss would be 9 wins. And I don't care who's on the schedule. Lane Kiffin has a 9 in front of his salaries. And so that should be the minimum win for the 4 of this program moving forward. Otherwise, you're overpaid. So if you're going to pay a coach $9 million a year, he can't get less than 9 wins, period. It's just the way that works. Also, when I was down at the Under Armour game, by the way, I was talking to somebody from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that was down there to cover all the players that Georgia had in that class. Apparently in 2024, their entire defense will be top 100 players.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's like, that's scary.
Yeah. Again, Jimbo is I think Saban should be nervous at this point with what Kirby's doing over at Georgia. It's absolutely insane. He is Stephen Willis, of course, host of Locked On Ole Miss, and doing a little bit of a crossover here with Locked On SEC. But Stephen, I assume you'll be talking all about leading up to the Grove Bowl and then reaction coming on Monday to what we see over the weekend, right?
Yeah, that's the plan. We talk football and try to talk football every single show, although we're trying to force feed a little bit of Chris Beard in there because we're trying to get Ole Miss fans ready for men's basketball because the last couple of years, they've kind of checked out at the end of December. So hopefully this year we'll be able to see what's going on. But yeah, come on over there for reaction on the Grove Bowl. We're going to be talking about transfer portal stuff because Beard and company is going to be heating up there, and the college transfer window opens up in like 4 days. This is absolutely ridiculous. So get ready for that as well.
Yeah. Does see Brandon Murray, the former LSU guy, is going to play for Chris Beard?
Yes, he was the first one. And I'm sure there's some others that I've heard. I've heard to pay attention to, I think his name's Austin Nunez out of Arizona State for a potential next name. So we'll see exactly what happens. Before
we let you go, what the hell's going on with Ole Miss baseball? What happened? You won a championship? You bought him out?
Well, we're obviously copying Mississippi State. No, what happened is Hunter Elliott went down, our ace went down, our closer went down, and our closer had to move to Friday night. So our pitching is just not where it needs to be. And now the offense is trying to hit 5-run home runs and things, it just happens. So I think for LSU, they're talking Hunter Elliott could be back. That's
what I heard, and that's good news there. He is Stephen Willis. Check him out, Locked On Ole Miss. Stephen, thanks so much for the time, man.
Oh, no problem at all. Anytime you need me.
All right, there he is, Stephen Willis, host of Locked On Ole Miss. This has been Locked On SEC. Thank you guys for making us your first listen every day. Now go make your second listen. Check out our Locked On College Basketball podcast. They have been recapping all the tournament action and talking about the transfer portal stuff and all of that. So go check them out wherever you get your podcast, Locked On College Basketball. I'm Chris Gordy. This has been Locked On SEC. We're going to continue throughout this week previewing some of the spring games happening this weekend. We knocked out Ole Miss. We still got to talk Tennessee, Arkansas, Florida, among others. We'll be talking all about it throughout this week here on Locked On SEC.